You're listening to Jefferson Exchange. Thanks for joining us. The JX starts today with the debrief, where JPR reporters discuss the stories they've been covering this week, including updates for Bay Area Hospital in Coos County, what's being done to stop the spread of invasive grasses, and more on the latest attempt to overhaul elections in Shasta County. I'm Maria Carter, JPR's news director.
I'm Emma J. Nelson, JPR's intern for the summer.
I'm Roman Battaglia, Science, Environment, and Politics reporter.
And I'm Justin Higginbottom, Public Health and Safety reporter.
Justin, you've been covering a potential deal between a private equity-owned company and Bay Area Hospital in Coos County. What's the update here?
So the deal is off. That's the update.
Okay, done.
Yeah. So this was a proposed sale or partnership or takeover, kind of depending on who you talk with, of Bay Area to a company named Quorum Health. So Quorum is a Tennessee-based company and owned by private equity, like you mentioned, which means it's run by investors but not publicly traded. People usually associate private equity with really intense profit maximization, so trying to squeeze out the most profit from a company as possible for investors. And last year, the hospital's board signed a non-binding letter of intent to explore Quorum running operations for Bay Area. Bay Area has been struggling financially since COVID, really, and this deal was thought of as a potential solution.
Well, you mentioned in your story that there was a pretty concerted effort by locals to oppose the deal. Tell us about one of those locals, Tracy Sweely.
Yeah, Tracy Sweely and her mother are really great characters. I enjoyed interviewing them. I've talked with them in the past, but they live in Coos Bay, and they came across this potential deal and kind of made it a mission of theirs to let other residents know about it. You know, not everyone is tuning into hospital board meetings, so not
Probably
everyone,
most people aren't.
right, but they did, and they figured out this deal was going on, and then they really opposed it, and they wrote op-eds in the local paper, they wrote letters to legislators, they organized weekly meetings of residents to oppose this deal. They also supported, with help from a hospital worker union, board members to replace those that signed that letter of intent with Quorum. So Bay Area is run by a public hospital district board, if that's kind of important. And their efforts paid off. So 4 new board members were elected recently, and those board members ran on keeping local control over Bay Area.
Well, why were residents like Tracy Sweely so against this deal?
They were concerned that Quorum would basically sell Bay Area for scraps. It would come in, it would extract as much profit from the hospital as possible, and then ditch it when it lost investors' money.
And that's something we've seen at other rural hospitals across the country, right?
Yeah, that's something we've seen happen even with Quorum. They've done that to a couple rural hospitals in the country, and this happens with private equity. Sometimes the goal is for them to make as much money for investors as possible. And so that worried residents like Sweely, and her mother. Although Quorum did say in the proposed deal that it wouldn't fire staff or close the hospital for 10 years after taking control, but people were looking down the line, and they thought this would be a possibility. Just to know, Bay Area, this hospital is very important for the region. It's the only major hospital on the southern Oregon coast. And losing it would mean residents might have to drive hours away to Bend or maybe even Medford for operations.
So the deal is off. What's next for Bay Area Hospital?
Well, it's still not in a great financial situation. So the hospital still has to repay a loan of about $50 million, which it defaulted on in March because it didn't hit a profit margin. It was supposed to that was part of the agreement for the loan. Also, there's these federal cuts in Medicaid, which could really impact it. Rural hospitals like Bay Area see a relatively high number of Medicaid and Medicare patients, but at this point, there's new leadership at the hospital. Like I mentioned, there's that new board who have an optimistic tone, at least. There's also a new interim CEO because the previous CEO also resigned. So Sweely, Tracy in Coos Bay, she seems optimistic about the future.
And so that's something we'll keep on following. Thanks, Justin. Emma J., you covered the Bureau of Land Management's use of aerial herbicides to kill invasive plants in southern Oregon. How are these invasive grasses causing problems?
Yeah, so the problem is actually twofold. They're outcompeting native plants and they are fueling these wildfires. Oliver Liu, who is the invasive annual grass specialist for the BLM Lakeview District Office, which is the ones doing these herbicide drops, told me they're targeting cheatgrass, Medusa head rye, and North Africa grass this year. Cheatgrass actually drives most of the wildfires that tear through those high desert, sagebrushy areas in the Lake and Klamath counties. So not only are they great fuels for these wildfires we're being affected by every year, but they grow during native plants' dormant season.
Well, why is that bad?
Well, they're sucking up all of the nutrients before the native plants can even get to them by the time it comes around to their growing season again. According to Lou, around 1.3-ish million acres of sagebrush land is lost every year to invasive grasses, and that's not just from the burning. It's from outcompeting these native plants. So the Lakeview office is actually focusing primarily on burn scars from the last year or so. 4 of the sites they are chemically treating will be where fires burned in 2024.
And is spraying these chemicals safe?
There is debate on that. The Lakeview District is using 2 herbicides this year. That's imazapic, which is commercially known as Plateau, and glyphosate, which you may have heard of because it's known as Roundup. It has a bit of a checkered past. The International Agency for Research on Cancer, which is a part of the World Health Organization, did classify the chemical as probably carcinogenic to humans in 2015. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean it will cause cancer. It means they found sufficient evidence it was a carcinogen in lab animals, so like mice and such, but limited evidence in humans. However, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency classified it as safe for humans in 2020. So you'd think they're done, but no, because a U.S. appellate court said that EPA didn't have enough evidence to back up the claim and overturned it 2 years later. So while the EPA still stands by its ruling, they do have to provide more evidence by 2026.
And so does that, are we're continuing to use it though, right?
Yeah. So Oliver Liu said the Lakeview District hasn't received any updated instructions from the BLM on not using the chemical, so they're going to. He told me that re-entry into areas sprayed should be safe by the time the herbicides dry, and signs will be posted where the sprays are happening, so just, don't go in if it looks wet. And you can also find maps of where these herbicides will be sprayed on the BLM website.
So it's still up for debate how safe it is for humans.
Yes.
What about the native plants?
Well, that's also tricky because imazapic is safe. It targets seeds that haven't been germinated yet, and since the native plants aren't propagating at the time they're doing these sprays, they'll be fine. However, glyphosate continues to be a little bit of a problem child. It goes for plants that are already in stages of growth. So for the most part, these native plants are out of their growing season and should be okay. But ones that aren't, they can be harmed by the chemical much like the invasive grasses are. So Lou says it's all comes down to being careful, or as careful as you can be when spraying herbicides out of a helicopter. They only use it where the invasive plants have entirely overrun an area, and they try to use it at the lowest strength possible.
Okay, well, thank you, Emma J. Yeah. Roman, you reported on attempts in Shasta County to overhaul its election system. I feel like we've said that exact thing before. Tell us what's going on there this time.
Yeah, so there's a new county clerk this year there. His name is Clint Curtis, and he's kind of trying to change the way they count votes there in the county. He wants to make things hyper transparent in the way he envisions it. He says there's been a lot of bad things about the election system in Shasta County. He said in a meeting on Tuesday that he's seen third world countries that do elections better, but he wouldn't provide examples to the Shasta Scout apparently about them. So we don't know what countries are doing elections worse. I don't know. But so he wants to do a couple of different things to the way they run elections there. He would probably like to hand count elections, but he can't do that because of a state law. So he wants to buy a bunch of these ballot counters instead to count ballots supposedly in 2 hours after the polls close, and also not count any of the ballots until the polls close. Normally, you count some of the vote by mail ballots before the before the polls closed to kind of get them out of the way. And he also wants to put cameras everywhere, covering literally every aspect of the process except for the parts where they legally can't do that. It's probably going to cost a lot of money, though, so that's why he came to supervisors on Tuesday this week and asked for money to fund this project. The estimates have kind of been spotty, and there hasn't been a lot of details, but county staff said it could cost at least $1.2 million, and then if it's successful, over the next 5 years, it costs between $6 to $8 million.
Okay, as we mentioned, we've talked about this before. Can you take us back in time? Give us a history lesson on the last few years of elections in Shasta
Yeah, I feel like I
County.
have to give a brief history lesson every single time I do this, and it gets longer and longer because there's more history. But previously, years ago, there were these big unproven claims of election fraud by a previous supervisor, Patrick Jones. That essentially culminated in this effort to force the previous county clerk there to hand count all of the ballots in the election. Hand counting ballots has been proven to be more time consuming, less accurate, and more expensive than using machines. So it's just not as good as machines, essentially. But they went ahead with that, and they started developing this plan. I went to a time where they tested out the hand counting system, and it just turned out to be it took a long time, and it was not very good. And it was going to cost millions more for every election, which the county, like
because
Shasta,
you'd have to pay people to count all those
exactly.
ballots.
You have to pay a lot of people to count them, and you have to keep counting. Like, you cannot stop counting once you start counting. But the state ended up stepping in, and they passed a law that banned hand counting in California in most elections. So that stopped Shasta County. Then the county clerk at the time, Kathy Darling Allen, resigned because of health issues, partially because of her role as county clerk and all of the stress, but she was replaced by someone without any experience running elections, although he ended up turning out to work well with the assistant who has a lot of experience there and did a good job, but then he also resigned because of health issues. And so that's where Clint Curtis got appointed. He comes from Florida. He is a computer programmer in the past and claims that, all these voting machines can be hacked and doesn't trust the current election system. He's also never actually run an election before, so, this is going to be his first time doing that too.
Well, let's catch us up to this week. What happened in the meeting with supervisors?
Well, there were a lot of unanswered questions that we didn't get the answer to. Curtis,
The definition of unanswered
yeah,
questions.
I guess so. Clint Curtis wanted the supervisors to approve a new lease on this vacant building in East Reading that they would use to count ballots. He says that the current building is really cramped and crowded. I mean, it is in a way, but, he wants to kind of have this large open space to count and have the people who want to watch the ballot counting process, make it easier for them. But he didn't have a lot of details on the actual cost of things or a definite plan and what he actually wanted to do. It kind of seemed like the estimates, too, that we were being given in terms of the cost were being given by county staff. And Curtis ended up pushing back on a lot of those estimates, saying that it would cost less or he could find ways to make things cheaper, or pulling out numbers, about how much money they would make in profit from printing ballots themselves, which was another thing he wants to do. Supervisors also had questions about the cameras and the lease and the costs and the alternatives, and they didn't get a lot of good resolution on those. I think an important note about all of this, and a big reason why this was controversial, is that the money that they would be giving to the county clerk to do this would be coming from this fund that the county has been saving up for to either build a new jail or fund this alternative custody program, which will help keep people out of jail and reduce recidivism rates. Jail overcrowding is a big issue in Shasta County and crime in general, and they've been really trying to work on reducing crime there. And because it's a budget thing, they needed 4 out of the 5 supervisors to approve a plan, and that means they just could not get the support for that. One of the supervisors refused to take money from that jail fund, saying that's more important, and that was the sentiment of a lot of the residents who spoke at the meeting there. And then another supervisor, Matt Plummer, was willing to give some money, but not enough to satisfy the board chair, Kevin Cry, who was kind of pushing this.
So was there any progress made?
In the end, not really. They went back and forth with numbers. Kevin Cry claimed that he could go to the landlord of this building and get them to give the county the building for $1 a month for 4 months, which I don't know how likely that would be.
I'll have him negotiate my deals
I know,
if that's
exactly.
the case.
But they ultimately could not reach a deal between the supervisors, so that kind of left Clint Curtis empty-handed.
Okay. Well, thank you for covering that. Justin, do you want to give us just a super quick update on the Prospect Hotel near Crater Lake?
Yeah, it's closed its doors and staff are all laid off because the owners claim their accountant has embezzled money from them for a period of time and also committed fraud. Last week, the Jackson County a Jackson County grand jury actually indicted that accountant on charges of theft and forgery. So it's a big case, and I would suggest going to our website and checking out the story about those details.
Sure. That's on our website at ijpr.org. That's it for the debrief this week. Thanks for listening. You can reach the newsroom with comments on our coverage and suggestions for things we should cover in the future through our news tip line. Again, ijpr.org. And you can find this program and more at jeffexchange.org or on your favorite podcast platform.